So when you open Flow Design, this is what it looks like. You've got a few demonstration models or import. So I'm going to click on import, find that document on my desktop. Oh, that one there, option B. Okay. Just give that a moment. Now, Flow Design it's like a wind tunnel. So it's just like a digital wind tunnel. If you've ever seen a wind tunnel, this is a piece of equipment that we used to use quite a lot before we had digital simulation. In a wind tunnel, you would put a physical model into a lab and you would blow air at it, and then you'd put smoke in and coloured dyes, and you'd watch the effect of the wind. Excuse me. Flow Design is the equivalent of a wind tunnel, but obviously you can do this in your own computer. You don't need a model, you don't need a wind tunnel lab. Okay, the model has been brought in. First of all, we need to get the orientation correct. It always brings it in with for some reason, with a slightly wrong orientation. Click on your orientation, and it's the X angle that we need to change by 90 degrees. And that will just change the model. Now, in Flow Design, in the previous versions, you could change your wind direction. In Flow Design, they've done it a different way. In Flow Design, you have to change your model direction. Okay, so in order to change the direction of the wind, you have to again go into orientation and change these angles. So if you change your Y angle here, okay. I mean, it doesn't really make any difference. It just means that it's a bit more like a physical wind model where your wind always comes from the same direction. You have to change your sight around. Okay. Okay, so we're in there. Now, it's a bit faint, but you've got some controls over here. Okay. And you've got a Viewcube, same as in Revit. So, same idea. If you click and drag your Viewcube, you can drag your model. Okay. You can drag your view, sorry. Equally, you can use the controls over there. Over here, you've got your usual sort of orbit, pivot tools that you'd be familiar with. When you're in that, when you've activated that, you have to re-click back on the button over here to deactivate it. Okay. Then also you've got your normal mouse controls, but slightly frustrating, it doesn't use exactly the same controls as Revit. So panning is slightly different. It's the left mouse. And also, the reason I don't use my mouse in Flow Design, what tends to happen, you end up with your model on its side because it does not constrain it to a vertical axis, which is quite frustrating. So I tend to navigate my model, I tend to either use the Viewcube up here, because that will always keep your verticals vertical, okay, or use the orbit tool, the pivot tool, sorry, around here. Okay. Right, I'm going to show you some of the tools in Flow Design. It's definitely a piece of software that you will benefit from having a little, a bit of practice yourself. Okay, let's go through some of the controls. So your first option, File, lets you save an image or save a video. So save image, I'll just put this on the desktop. Okay, that will just save. If I just view that, so it will just save out an image of what was on the screen. Okay. So it just gives you a screenshot of the simulation, just exactly what you had on the screen. Takes away the toolbars. Okay. So that's all fairly straightforward. Save video, you can have a play with that yourself. Save video, it just exports a video of the wind simulation, basically. You've got a little lighting, a little light box there. I just tend to leave it on. You've got various different color schemes you can use. You can find which you prefer. That one's quite a good one. And you've got contours, and you've got banding. And I actually find putting the banding and the contours on is quite helpful. This is your key. Top left there is your key, which is a velocity in meters per second. And I just find by putting the banding on, it's a bit easier to understand what these colours mean. So for example, that yellow is 14 meters per second. This dark blue is sort of 0 to 1 meters per second. Okay. So that's okay. So let's just go through some of these tools. So that was all about our different color schemes. Next one, dark or light environment. It's just a graphic visibility thing. I don't know, I think the dark one works quite well. Okay, but you can just toggle between those. I'll leave it on dark, I think. Then we've got, these are our toolbars. A useful one here is tunnel bounds. So if we click on tunnel bounds and zoom out a little bit, what this is showing us is what size simulation do we need? Now, there's not a lot of point having a simulation which is much larger than your site. So in this instance, I would probably drag these arrows here and make my simulation a little bit smaller. It takes a little while to recalculate. Okay. It will just save out on a bit of processing power and a bit of speed if you make that simulation a bit smaller. Okay. You don't really have to. I've not found flow design crashes very often. The old version used to be terrible. It used to crash all the time. You had to, when you were using it, you had to keep saving images because the thing would just crash before you could get anywhere. But seems to be better. And I mean, I'm not exactly using it on a high-powered computer. This has got an i7 chip in it. Okay, so I'm just making my simulation area a bit smaller there. Okay, that's that. If we go back in here, I'm going to turn my tunnel bounds back off. Okay, so there's our simulation. You've got a few other things in here. You've got a drag plot, which I don't... The drag plot is more if you're testing like a sort of vehicle or an aeroplane, which probably not so relevant for us. switch that off. Okay, let's go through some of the other tools. But I'm going to firstly go into the last one. And this one is you dictate whether you want to slice in a vertical or a horizontal plane. So if I go into a top view here, zoom in a bit, what I've done there, just pan that a little bit, is I've changed that into a top view, a sort of horizontal slice. So you can see now our buildings are peeking through that, and it's simulating the flow of the wind. If I just zoom out a little bit here. Okay. And what you can do by simply selecting this little ball here, you can drag that plane and set it at whatever height you want. Okay? And that will re-simulate the wind. Now, I'll leave it up to you to decide, how you want to create this for your report, whether you want to create these views in a plan view, a three-dimensional view, that's up to you. But if we just, for example, look at this simulation here, I just pan a little bit more, the kind of thing you might observe from here is we've got a wind flow coming across here, and these sort of bright yellow areas or bright red areas are places on that site where the wind velocity is being increased. So the impact of these buildings is creating these faster areas of wind speed, which could be something as a designer that you're perhaps slightly concerned about. Okay, so just going to go through some of the other settings. So next one, the first one, the simulation, you have a simulation resolution. So how detailed do you want the simulation? At the moment, it's set on 100%, which is quite low setting, but gives you quite reasonable results. If you had a more detailed model, you can set that to a higher level. Your wind tunnel settings. Now this is really important. Your wind speed. So what speed do you want to test? Now if we go back, I won't open it now. If you imagine your windrows for your site, the kind of typical wind speeds you might want to test are, you might want to test, let's say, the average wind speed, which, as we saw, was about 6 meters per second. So if we go back in here, let's set that to 6 meters per second, and we now simulate a slower wind speed. You have to give the simulation a moment to recalculate. So we're now simulating a much slower wind speed, a sort of average wind speed for this site. What you might also want to do is simulate the real peak wind speeds. So particularly on this site, you notice the simulation is now working its way through. You have to give it a few moments to push that wind through. And now, because we're starting with a much slower wind speed, we're not getting such high wind velocities. Okay, what you have to watch for as well is the color key does change. Okay, so what it does is yellow is always your highest wind speed, blue is your lowest. It's not a fixed scale. Okay, you might also want to simulate your peak velocities. So if we put that wind up to 18 meters per second, so we're now simulating a really sort of high storm, and now we can look at the impact of that. Okay, so I'm just going to put that back down to something more reasonable. Let's put that back down to 10. Orientation. As we mentioned before, the wind is propagated from this direction in flow design. So if you want to simulate your model in another the wind in another direction, you need to spin your site around. Just give it a moment. So now we are simulating the wind coming from a different direction on our site. Okay. So that's the orientation. 2D or 3D, I'll come back to that. We can either show wind velocity, which is probably more useful for us, or pressure, so the wind pressure on that site. I think for what we're doing, velocity is more useful. Drag plot, I think you can ignore, because that, again, is about testing vehicles, cars, so on. So I don't think you need to worry about that. Okay, plane or flow lines. If you put flow lines on, as you see, we no longer get that kind of colour-coded plane, but we get these flows. And if you kind of look quite closely, you get some turbulence. So in some respects, it can be easier to understand those areas of turbulence. I'll just zoom in a bit there. Okay. Once you activate flow lines, you get further settings. Tubes, smoke, particles, probably lines is easier. And you've got settings for your lines. So how many do you want? I mean, that's, can be quite useful, because bear in mind, you've still got your velocity color-coded here, and the benefit of the lines is you get to see that sort of turbulent effect. So if you look here, for example, we're in very low velocity and the wind is actually kind of blowing backwards and it's turbulent, whereas here the wind's flowing very fast past our buildings. We can slow down the visual effect of those lines, speed them up. Size, you can make them thicker, thinner. Okay. Length. You can control the length of them. Okay. So that's controlling the graphic interface. Usual, you can save image. So this should, desktop, this should save that frozen image. Let's just go and check that. Where have I put it? There. So this is just a frozen image. It's taking a long time. Nope. All right, that's just my computer for some reason. But there's the there's the image that we've just exported anyway. Okay, so that was flow lines or plane. Lines, settings. Okay. And again, the top view, side view, you can change. So we're now viewing those flow lines in a side view. Okay. Now again, I don't think you know, I wouldn't get too concerned about a kind of high level wind flow around your building. You know, I'm not really asking you to consider, you know, what's the implication of that wind velocity flowing over the top of your building. That's a little bit high level. But what you might use the side view for is to perhaps look at, is there anything, are there any concerns on your exterior spaces? Perhaps if you're designing some outside spaces, for example, you might look to see if there are any real kind of problem areas in that side view. Normally, the top view is the more useful. Oh, sorry, because we flipped the we flipped the direction. They call it differently. Okay, I'm going to put that back into a plane. It says our plane view again. Now there is also so if we change to simulation mode, let's give that a second, and we'll put it back on flow lines. You get a much more complex three-dimensional simulation. Now, personally, I find it difficult to work with because there's too much information in a way to understand. It also slows your computer down massively. So I normally just work in the 2D mode, which I think is a better way of working, actually. If it gets there, you will see it will perform a simulation in a kind of three-dimensional environment. But I'm not sure if it's going to do it. Yeah. So, okay. So you see, it's performing that simulation now. And we can customize how it looks. I guess it's kind of, like what you might have seen in an old-fashioned wind tunnel. Okay, I've just slowed it down a bit there. So it's difficult, it's difficult to understand, I think, because you're just seeing everything at the same time rather than a slice. But you can have a look. Yeah, it's simulating the entire wind flow simulation in one go. You might find you can make that work for you. Okay. Oops. Particles. I'm going to put that back to 2D. Okay, we're going to stop now and have a break. So I've shown you the basics of the software. It's not a terribly complex software. I think the key thing is for you to think about how you might use it for your assignment to get into some early stage simulation of this site. Okay? And I think that's what it is useful for. You can start to identify possible problem areas. I think the way you should imagine it is imagine that you're providing some early stage guidance on this design, but before this building is built, finally, let's assume that there will be a professional consultant aerodynamicist involved, and they will perform a more complex simulation, and also they have design insurance, because as an architect you wouldn't normally advise on kind of wind flow design. So imagine that you're maybe going to identify some problem areas, propose some solutions as an outline early stage design, and then that kind of expert consultant later on would do some more complex simulation. Okay.